A horrific end to a vault and its dwellers is usually the direct byproduct of the experiment that Vault-Tec decided to conduct within. The malevolent brainchild of one of the many scientists at Vault-Tec that just wanted to ask, what if? For some, there was a chance to survive, but others were literally designed, from the word go, to subject their inhabitants to something awful. Yes, we are looking at you, Vault 92, but today, we see something different. Today, the scientists at Vault-Tec managed to get hundreds killed and wreck their vault, and it was a complete accident. Or another group decided to use them as test subjects, as we'll discuss. Either way, they totally deserved it. Yes, today we look, once again, at Vault 22, and as such followed New Vegas, with all of its beloved micro-stuttering that I completely forgot about until I went to get my footage. A place I covered all the way back when I was starting out, but it's been like a decade and you, the people, voted and wanted me to cover it again. So before we begin, a word of warning. This story overlaps with that of Randall Clark, one of the hardest lads in all the wastes, but I'm only covering the parts that overlap with Vault 22. If you'd like to see that story again, let me know in the comments. As always, likes and comments really help out, and if this video does well, we'll definitely be covering some of the older locations again. Now, let's take a look at the vault, where the veg took over. The exterior of the vault stands out like a sore thumb in the Mojave. It's lush, it's green, it's not all dead like the rest of the place. The signs say the plants kill? Yes, that could be bad. Yeah, we'll get back to that. But yes, this vault is looking very nice, with grass covering everything, and plants ranging from small, all the way up to full-on trees. Indeed, the door itself is actually jammed open with either a tree or an incredibly large root. We'll have to explore more to see whether the root forced it open over time, or the door was left open for some reason. Now, with no context for why all this is here, we're left scratching our heads and suspiciously looking at all the plants for the one that will go for the throat. But we can actually take a closer look at the sign and see that it's here to tell us exactly what the vault's purpose was. It reads as follows. Under the heart of the Mojave Desert, Vault 22 provides a fertile laboratory for experimentation on stable crops to maximize their potential. Within the vaults, scientists and horticulturalists continue to innovate our understanding of agricultural possibilities in the fight against the global food crisis. The scientists who developed a miracle fertilizer within have made a profound impact on your ordinary life. So take a second to reflect on the hard work of Vault-Tec scientists at improving crop productions in arid biomes like the Mojave, and for increasing the crop's resistance to insects, drought, and diseases. Well, there we go. Video over. We have all of our answers about what the vault did, right? Haha, not a chance. It's all hit the fan in there, don't you worry. But this sign is actually both informative and very strange. It's informative in that, on the face of it, we learn what the vault was doing. Research into improving the crops at the time to cope with harsher environments, likely so they could either be grown in less favourable conditions, like in a desert, or, as we shall see, in a vault, which would really help with food shortages. But more interesting than that is, why is there a sign at all? Most vaults were, to a certain extent, hidden, or at least not hugely advertised, so the fact that they were advertising it suggests this vault was somewhat of a PR stunt. A way to show off how Vault-Tec was doing more than just making vaults, and to get the public on their side. Additionally, it seems unlikely that it was just put here so people after the fallout could see it. Therefore, from the tone of the sign, it seems likely the scientists were already here in the vault before the world ended, conducting research, much like Vault 4 from the Fallout TV show. This could mean the research done here was actually intended to assist with the issues of food production in other vaults, but then never actually got exported to them. Although, as we'll see, another group had somewhat of a hand in this as well, and it could be argued they were ultimately responsible for what happened here. Now let's get in there and see what became of the Vault-Tec smooth brains. Immediately inside, we can see that the roots are propping the door open, and at some point, an attempt was made to close it. As we'll see later, they didn't force it open. Also, the roots are coming from deeper inside the vault. We can also see various fungi dotting the ground, and as we learn about what it is that took down the vault, it will become clear what these are. On the other side of the room, we can find the equipment of someone called Keely, as the terminals will soon make clear, who set up camp here at the entrance before she continued deeper in. She seems to have taken several plants and put them in pots or troughs to observe their growth, likely accelerated given the research that was going on here, and what has happened outside. It also seems to indicate that she was the last one through here, as everyone else has been warned off given the reputation of the vault. On her terminal, we can see that it was still connected to the Vault 22 interlab network, indicating that at least some of the systems are still in operation after all this time. She also seems to have hacked her way in, given the unauthorized login, which is confirmed in the first entry. The power is still running, but not to the same degree as before, and we may get somewhat of an answer to this later on. Logs that we don't get to see indicate that over the past several months, several people have entered, and no one's left. Now, this is pretty interesting, as later logs seem to imply she wasn't aware of the danger of the plants, but someone had to have been, as they got out and left that sign. Either that, or someone came after Keely and did so. The second entry talks about the growth of the entrance, and how it shouldn't have been able to reach that stage, given the lack of sunlight. As already pointed out, it is originating from further inside the vault. This would seem to imply that the roots and the plants sought out the light by moving up through the vault, eventually reaching the outside. Hildren is one of the individuals at the NCR that can send you here, and that sent Keely here due to an interest in the growth of the plants here, that growth being the key as to why they're thriving in these conditions. Moving deeper in, we can start to see plants and fungi thriving in various piles of dirt located around the vault. I'll be honest, this still confuses me, as I don't know where they came from. It's a vault, it's concrete and steel. Yes, there's a cave network underneath, but unless the former inhabitants will say, we're doing this, it's a little odd to me. Unless, of course, people were dumping soil out in the name of science, but that would be a bit mental, so probably not. However, this is a common sight as we move through, and only gets more common. We will ignore the elevator while we're here, opting to use the stairs instead, as it will take us to each floor in the order we want. It's also the healthier option, and helps us get our steps in. Also, you aren't imagining it, the vault door did say 92, and the others say 101. The miracle of reused assets. The next floor down is where we'll really start to see the spread of vegetation. Large roots and trees can be seen emerging from the floor, again driving home the point of both the origin of this growth deeper in, and how the plants are still growing upwards to get more light. In this case, it's happened to such an extent that tables and mainframes are being displaced by the roots and trunks. Also of interest is the ventilation is still pumping out air, and in some places the vegetation has even begun taking over that as well. Now, as we unravel the story here, we'll learn that it wasn't just vegetation that was overtaking the ventilation, and it's not just air circulating here. To the left, we find the first of many greenhouses of sorts, both in this lab and others. This really highlights just how hardy these plants were. Not only are they surviving down here with very little sunlight, remember, they've been here for a very long time. We'll get more of a timeline later, but these haven't been tended in centuries, unless, again, Keely set this up. So they appear to be able to thrive in these small enclosures, with far less than ideal conditions, just fine. Back out in the hall, we come across more weird patches of dirt with a lot of vegetation. Now here, this is all we get, but we shall see, just a little later, something less benign than fronds lurking in the soil. And no, I don't mean snakes. Past this, we get to another lab and see an example of plants being exposed to artificial sunlight, something that was integral to the research here, as the crops needed to be able to thrive inside the vault. Honestly, this is probably the reason why there's so much more growth outside of the vault entrance. These plants have managed on so little for so long, that when those limitations disappeared, they just spread like an infestation. It makes it unlikely this was ever intended for arid conditions besides a vault, as this kind of growth would be pretty hard to contain, meaning Vault-Tec may have sold this as higher crop yields, but really, they just wanted to cheap out on the amount of resources that they would need to stock the vaults with, the cheap bastards. The terminal here, however, tells us nothing of this research. It's part of the atmospheric effects subsystem, and there's only one entry, noise complaint. It's a totally not concerning entry of noises in the vents, noises that apparently have already been looked into. Though the maintenance staff could just be crap at their job. It's also something that several people are reporting as well. Now, all we've seen so far are plants in the vents. So unless this is actually a pyramid located in South America, with a cell phone constructed from vegetation in it, for any of you who get that reference, then it's probably not the plants. Well, they were not imagining it, and it's going to get a lot worse, but more on that soon. Through the other side of the lab, we get to a room where Keely, the ghoul researcher, sets up after you rescue her. Here, we find the first of the UV setup she has around the vault, on some of the thicker patches of vegetation. Now, the why of this will become clear soon. We'll get to her later on, so for now, pretend she isn't even there. If you pickpocket, I mean ask her nicely, you can get access to her terminal, and the 3 entries she has on it. But that can come in a minute. First, we can go further into this room and come across the first of many half-arch barricades here, in this case blocking the storage room. On the other side of it, we can see that something, clearly whatever the barricade was put up to stop, broke through the wall of the vault from a pre-existing cave system, a system we shall come to learn was, to a certain extent, part of the vault as well. A little further down the tunnel, we find a wooden door. Now, I'm not certain about this barricade or this door. As we go deeper in, we see others that were definitely put up by the vault dwellers. But this one, given its proximity to Keely's workstation, could have been her. The door also seems very makeshift for a research vault. Back in the main room, we can take a look at some more of our entries of our expedition here. This terminal was originally connected to the oxygen lab system, and we get 3 of our entries here. The first gives us some useful insight into the research here. On this level, they wanted plants that outputted a larger amount of oxygen than normal, presumably to either complement or even replace the air production and circulation systems entirely. We did see a lot of pipes for air intake and transportation, so it does make sense this would happen here. There were also some large pipes in the rooms with the plants. We don't know whether they were only using the plants for oxygen, partially using them, or even if this got past the research stage. Next is entry 4, and it talks about some irregularities with the air system. Restraints have been lifted and bypassed, somehow altering something about said air circulation system. Now we don't know the reason for this here, but we do get some speculative answers later on. For now, keep it in mind. I can't remember exactly, but I think in my original video, many moons ago, I might have used this as an argument that all of this was engineered by Vault-Tec as part of an experiment, which doesn't actually seem to be the case. You know, for once. The final entry explains what was happening in that noise complaint entry. Giant mantises, which we've yet to encounter, have somehow infested the vault. Or at least at first glance, that seems to be the case. Now that doesn't match what the sign outside said, as mantises are, to the best of our vast knowledge, not a plant. She also agrees that something else must have been dispatching the mercenaries that were entering the vault. Another thing of interest is they don't seem to care about Keely. They don't seem to register her at all, which doesn't seem to be the case for other mantises we encounter in the wastes, who react like arseholes. We get more information as to why this is probably the case, but we'll get to that as we find out more about what was infecting everything here. Now, it's time to look at the next level, where it all really starts to kick off. As soon as we arrive, well, we get to the main horrific point of this vault. The remains of the vault dwellers, mutated, corrupted, and twisted into something called a Spore Carrier, an interesting name, and one we shall talk about more at length. I'll at least say it's related to fungi. For now, it's enough to talk about their appearance and how we find them, so we'll take a slight detour to do just that. Overall, they look like an inbred version of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They are found either crouched in or lying down among all the vegetation. Although what's unclear is whether this is to camouflage themselves to more effectively hunt prey, or because, given what they are now, the soil's a better habitat for them. Possibly they need it. It does allow them to conceal themselves, and this probably aided them in tearing apart the mercenaries that came down here. Mercenaries that have likely joined their number now, let's be honest. As stated, a weird thing they do, but we don't really observe much, is lie prone on the ground. This seems to back up what we learn later from Keely. You probably have no idea what I'm talking about because some bug seems to prevent this, and instead they just keep glancing around quickly like they've found the one ring and want to make sure no one else is around. This could also contribute to how long they survived, given they seem to enter some sort of hibernation, which we don't really see in the spore carriers we see in other locations. This might limit the overall amount of nutrition they need to survive. They seem to constantly expel a green cloud from their bodies, which we learn later are spores, spore carrier. The clue is, in fact, in the name. Something else they can do is explode. This seems to occur if you get close enough for long enough, or they take enough damage. It seems to be some response to what they perceive as death or pain, like a last-ditch attempt to infect as many things as they can before they bite the dust. For now, we'll just have to acknowledge these behaviors, and wait until we get more information to figure out why they did it. Coming out of their backs is a kind of growth that seems like a plant at first, and maybe part of the camouflage, or to increase the surface area for gathering light. Their skin is completely green, likely as a side effect of the fungi spreading through their bodies. We get more information on what it actually is quite soon. It could possibly be an adaptation to their surroundings. If it was an adaptation, it was likely so they could absorb light and then carry out photosynthesis, allowing them to survive without food that their former bodies previously needed. The leaves, if you want to call them that, coming out of their backs, likely help out with this if that is the case. Given the large amount of growth around their eyes, they seem to be completely blind now, which means they must attack prey by some other means. One option is information from the mycelium network they're possibly connected to, being, infested with fungi. They no longer walk upright, instead golluming their way towards you on all fours, before either pouncing or swiping at your ankles. This, and, sitting in the soil all day, shows that anything that remains of them as human is long gone, except possibly some vague familial connections, which we'll get to soon. Also, their brain kinda seems to be gone as well, given the way the top of their head just comes off when we shoot them. This would seem to suggest the fungi are just drifting in the remains of humans, and no higher order brain function seems to remain. Additionally, Christ the Night, why are their hands and feet so huge? They've got some big old sideshow bobs and grippers now. No idea why that's emerged, as they do seem very stationary. But given the goal, as we shall discuss, was to spread, well, I guess being able to grab, climb and move rapidly would help out with that. All in all, really the best enemy added in as an area-specific foe in the base game, as far as I am concerned. As we go on, we can add our information regarding them and answer some of these questions. But for now, back to our journey through the vault. Just past that first carrier, we come to another room with some of Keely's equipment set up. She's again exposing the plants to UV light, and we get the why of this soon. The room looks like where the water, either for the plants or the wider vault, was treated or filtered. By taking a look at the terminal here, along with some more of Keely's entries, this is exactly the information we get, being told it's the water purification system. Reasonable to conclude it's for the whole vault, not just what the plants were exposed to. Entry 6 gives us some more information regarding the Spore Carriers, beyond what we can speculate just by looking at them. Keely states that the substance on their skin is actually lichen, or something close to it. Given its ability to adhere to surfaces a lot better than other plants, this makes sense why it would grow in the carriers. It could also mean that it actually originated in the caves, as opposed to being something the scientists were growing here, as we find no mention of it elsewhere. She states the Spore Carriers are the former scientists, and so vault dwellers, which means she did have a certain degree of knowledge of the vaults before coming here. She too points out they blend in very well. She also says bodies, as if they're dead. Now if they were moving or reacting to her, it would make more sense if she said what they become. So I wonder if they too, like the mantises, didn't respond to her at all, and she thought they just died and then the lichen had grown over them. This makes sense, given she was able to walk past several before she even noticed one. She says it's not contagious to ghouls, and this may be the reason why she's being ignored, because of what we will learn later drives everything in this vault. Entry 7 gives you a clue as to where the research data of the vault is, if this is why you're here. This level was primarily focused on increasing crop yield, as we shall see on some of the other terminals. Honestly, it does make a lot of sense why the NCR would want this data, given the large population they have to feed, and that growing crops was hard enough before the world became as irradiated as it is now. Leaving this room and heading to the left, we can actually see an interesting little detail. One of the regions of vegetative growth that a spore carrier was located on was directly under an overhead lamp, possibly backing up that they do indeed need some kind of light to survive, as they haven't had many other sources of food for a while down here. To the left, we come to a lab where they actually were growing crops. Other plants, and indeed even trees, have also started to take root here. Yet despite the fact that some of the crops are dead, there is some food, even after all these centuries. True, Keely could have been setting up some to grow, but we get no information stating that. There's also the possibility that there were some automated protocols in place to water the plants and expose them to light, which could explain how everything has survived this long. But again, we can't be sure. We can find another terminal here, and this time it isn't from Keely. It's connected to the food production subsystem, so definitely of interest to the NCR. There are 3 terminal entries, the first being Status Report 9228. It states that the yield of the crops is improving, and this stems from something called Cultivar GN188. This also explains why the plants here were, and still are, thriving. They can subsist off of artificial light, which was the goal overall. We also begin to learn about Dr. Peters. He's apparently off of work sick, and has been for several days now. He's apparently not a particularly diligent worker, so they've just assumed he's lying. This was not the case, as we'll see. The next entry, Status Report 9253, shows us that the disregard for safety and human decency is alive and well in this vault. Someone from the Pest Control level, further down in the vault, sent them something. A substance that is secreted by a specimen they have to attract insects. It can apparently alter the mood of small animals, and they want volunteers to test it on. In a vault, cut off from the outside world. Yup. Also, just remember that. Small mammals, as in not humans. It goes on to show the escalating signs that something was indeed happening here, as many of the staff are now showing the effects of a viral infection. The scope is currently unknown, but apparently it'll soon be enough that no one will be left to do research. Now, we can't be exactly sure how large the vault is, but information later suggests it's at least 200, so this must have been quite a few people, although for some reason they're not particularly alarmed just yet. That begins to change in the next entry, Status Report 9312. Dr. Peters has died, and then apparently reanimated and attacked people. But it's fine. 'Twas simply a rumor started on a lark, right? It's not like we've seen any evidence of bodies reanimating, right? Dr. Peters appears to be the first to pass, and if everyone else is infected with the same thing, well, you can guess where this is going. So the crop yield improvements seem to stem from splicing GN188 with the existing crops. This was to increase the yield, but if this was the miracle fertilizer they talked about, which clearly means there was no miracle fertilizer, then it's reasonable to assume that it was also responsible for the increased oxygen output in the plants as well. Whether or not it's related to the sickness spreading through the vaults, well, let's see. Heading out of that room and taking a right past the previous patch of dirt I drew your attention to regarding the overhead lighting, we come to another room, and this is where we can start to see the caves come into play. At the other side of the room is a door leading directly to them. But before all of that, let's look at this terminal here, with its hilarious collection of escalating entries ending in "just help." The most useless of all email subjects. The first is a security request entry. Someone called Mathers, who seems to be on the research team, has disappeared in the caves. Now how long had passed before this message, we don't know, but clearly enough time for concern to arise. Why they'd be worried about the caves at all, given, at this point, the problem of corpses supposedly reanimating and attacking people wasn't widespread, or present at all, we aren't sure yet. But at the least it confirms the caves, for whatever reason, were in fact a point of research for this vault. The entry after this is medical emergency, and it gives us somewhat of a timeline. Dr. Peters apparently helped one of the security escorts back from the caves, presumably after they all went to look for Mathers, who I think we might find later on, kind of. Whatever had occurred had clearly disturbed him, as he couldn't articulate where the officer was, probably titty bread at this point. All the doors were to be sealed until a proper investigation could take place, and this is still the case when we get here. This tells us that it all went sideways shortly after this, although not too shortly, as Peters was still sick for a while before dying. However, I think it's reasonable to assume that he was the first infected, and it probably occurred while he was in the caves. The final entry is help, and this is when the vault seems to have truly started to fall. Security were engaging something, and were in desperate need of backup. Since it says down there, this might have been an entry from higher up, as why would they be asking for help from the higher levels for the lower ones? Also, just keep Dr. Bailey and his wife and daughter in mind. A family of 3, that'll be important later on. Regardless of who was requesting this, it's clear that something was attacking people. Now whether this was from the caves, or within the vaults, and related to the reanimation of corpses, we don't know yet, but we've seen walls smashed in leading to the caves, so it's clear something forced its way out. We know it was already attacking people, as Mathers likely died to it, as did at least one guard. Taking a quick look at the parts of the cave accessible to us here, we possibly get a culprit? The holiest of insects, the praying mantis, a creature that Keely already identified as being present here, although they, like the Spore Carriers, left her alone. Not us though, they try and jump straight up our asses, the saucy wee bastards. Now there are a lot of them down here, along with signs they were laying eggs, which, given the information we're going to get later, it seems to be counter to what they were meant to do if food was short. Given the makeshift door joins up to this part of the caves, it seems likely they may have played a hand in busting down the walls. This is backed up by the fact that people could hear them in the vents already, before the vault fell. But why did they start attacking people? Where did they even come from? And why are they this size? Well, we need to venture into the lower levels to answer those questions. The next level down is the crew quarters, and predictably, this is where a lot of the Spore Carriers can be found, given this is where everyone lived. Trees and vines can also be found here, in larger numbers than elsewhere. This is likely due to the vegetation that was already set up here, and the larger level of artificial light we can find, given this is where people were living. Across the walkway, we can find the recreation area / canteen. If we take a look, it appears like it was abandoned in a hurry. Although given we know other people did indeed come here, even if they didn't leave, then this could just be them enjoying the leftover food before they got taken out. Or it could just be Keely, as she had somewhat of a free reign here, and we can find another UV light setup beside another one of her terminals here. In a cruel and harsh twist of fate, the terminal tells us that this is the Guess What trivia game. But looking at the first entry, Expedition Entry 8, Keely has taken this possible joy from us. She overwrote the game, depriving us of a brief moment of normalcy in this otherwise dumpster fire of a vault. The entry also tells us what we already know, or will know when we walk in here. A lot of people died here. She says they succumbed to an airborne infection. This is why she set up the UV lamps in multiple parts of the vault, to check the air for contaminants. Interestingly, she seems to be immune to whatever it is. I mean, granted, it doesn't affect us either, but in her case, this actually explains a lot of what happens to her, as we'll see. The last entry here, and her final expedition log, tells us what this was. Some kind of spore had spread throughout the vault and infected everyone. This is likely the source of the fungi we see in various amounts throughout our journey here. Moreover, the concentration increases as you go further into the vault, meaning that naturally, the caves had the highest level of concentration. The caves where Peter was when he was attacked by the mantises. Now, if the mantises didn't affect him, but this airborne spore did, then it's reasonable to think this was only just spreading at this point. But the Spore Carriers, which are what all the infected seem to turn into, do attack people. So this is likely what drove the mantises to start doing this as well. So then the question we have to ask ourselves is, what was this spore, and where did it come from? I mean, come on now guys, this is a vault, so surely it couldn't have been the result of Dunning-Krugers messing around with things they didn't understand, right? Directly opposite that room, on the other side of the walkway, we come to the most important place, the toilets. Here we find something great in the ladies' toilets, a Spore Carrier. But now we know that these were what happened to the infected vault dwellers. which means this person died on the toilet. Or I guess it's more accurate to say in the cubicle, because for some reason the toilet's just missing. Now they could have come in here after, that's totally plausible, but I like to think this is where they were when they died. Past the toilets, we come to the overseer's office, which is completely overgrown. Disappointingly, there is extremely little on the overseer's terminal. I suppose, given this wasn't a vault where people were actually being subjected to an experiment, there wouldn't be. The only thing here is a terminal that lets us unlock some of the doors down here. Although, given they were all locked, it suggests that someone put the vault into lockdown, given what was happening. Going down into the crew quarters themselves, we find the majority of the Spore Carriers left in the vault. I suppose, given this is where they turned, or came back to life, if these are indeed just fungi-piloted human meat puppets, then that makes sense. They do seem very inactive when there's no prey. Taking a look in the utility room, we can find another terminal. The first entry is titled Strange Noises, and demonstrates the cracked tape they had working down here. I kid, but this was definitely the mantises beginning to prowl the place, likely as the spore had already begun to infect them. The next entry fills in a lot of the blanks for us, as it relates to a supposed gas leak. Now this is because people complained about coughing fits and respiratory issues, not because of any smell or an actual explosion. I say this because gas is present in the vault, but as we'll see, it wasn't related to this. The mass of the air is apparently slightly off, likely given the spores that are now permeating it and have been collecting on the air filters. Now why these filters didn't work, I honestly have no idea. Some of the information at the Pest Control level may tell us. We can actually see these were HEPA filters, and they're meant to prevent situations like this, to remove and trap contaminants. So why a vault that was literally dealing with R&D on plants, and therefore would have to be very careful as to what cross-pollinated or got near what, wouldn't be able to handle this? I have no idea. But this is Vault-Tec, and they aren't known for thinking stuff through, let's be honest. We can also find a generator in the other room, possibly giving us an explanation as to what caused the lower power output of the vault that was mentioned in the terminal entries upstairs. So we know that the spores were permeating the vaults and infecting people, and we know they spread through the vents, bypassing whatever safeguards were in place, including the filters. But how much of this should have been a warning sign? How fast did it spread? And what steps were taken to attempt to control it? Well, if we go to the clinic across the way from this room, we find the answer. The terminal present here will give us the information we need. This is a database of patient cases, with the first being 162, Dr. Peters' case, who we learn is called Harrison. The initial diagnosis is pneumonia due to the spreading of microorganisms in his lungs, and their recommendation was rest and check back twice. I mean, really? Like, this is normal? You identify a microorganism that is causing something they can kill, and you just go, yeah, a bit of R&R, drink some water, don't go outside when Venus is in retrograde. Maybe it just didn't seem harmful, but it is a bit strange they didn't seem more concerned about what this was and where it came from. Case 164 after this one is a group one, and 5 people, including apparently someone from the Shire, are all sick. They state the symptoms are remarkably similar, so we know that we're dealing with a true genius here. I mean, if one person got infected, they all could be infected. This is a vault, it's a closed system. We also get the information that Dr. Peters started showing symptoms a week ago, which was after he came back from the caves, if he did take the advice to stop working. So whatever this spore was, it took about a week to spread and to infect multiple people. The next entry is an update for Dr. Peters. His condition seems to have worsened, which means he must have gotten worse when he was coming back twice a day. His body's actively rejecting treatment, likely as it's already been hijacked by the spores. Now the part about exploratory surgery is odd, as if they hadn't done something already. How did they know he had microorganisms in his lungs? I guess they could have taken a sample, somehow, but how were they sure? After this is another group, this time with either 13 or 14 people. Someone's apparently just called Herman with no second name, but I assume the names were just entered wrong. At this point, apparently isolating people to stop the spread was being considered, but whether or not this was actually carried out in the end, we don't know. To be honest, too little too late at this point. Although, as we'll see later, not everyone was infected or exposed the same way. The last 2 entries are about Harrison Peters. The first tells us he did indeed die. They decided the surgery was necessary, but he died just before it. The autopsy was performed, and his lungs were caked in a form of fungal growth. A growth that was apparently still spreading despite him being dead, which I guess makes sense. He's a source of nutrients now for the fungus. The final part's very interesting, as it does confirm the vault had mycologists. They wouldn't need them if they weren't working on something to do with mycology, so level 5 might have the answers we need. But the last entry is where it all really kicks off. Peters reanimated and tried to attack the doctor in the clinic. Now they state they locked him in here and called security. But this is where things get a little odd. We know that people were already talking about the corpse reanimating, as whoever was writing the entries about people getting sick called it a rumour. There is some flamer fuel and a flamer near here, and the Spore Carrier isn't here when we arrive, so we can assume security killed it. But given we learn later on how long this took to take effect after they killed him, why weren't further steps taken, as they know that everyone's likely infected with the same thing? Now, to be fair, we don't know what the timescale between him being killed and the rumour circulating was, but security and the doctor knew, so unless the timescale got shorter, or was somehow different for other patients, then they should have had a few days before the next batch dropped and came back. It could be, at this point, they decided it was too bad to contain. This might also explain the steps taken with the air system, that we shall get to very soon. Now, we can take a look at the living quarters of the vault. Quarters that, given the numbers we get later, are way too small, but we can probably just chalk this up to the vault being retconned or changed in DLCs. Heading in, there are 4 rooms, and some of them do have Spore Carriers present. However, the first one on the left is the one that is of most interest to us. Inside, we find 3 Spore Carriers. One of them is a runt. Now, there is a crib here, and we know that one of the people who got sick, Bailey, had to look after his wife and daughter. A family of 3 we know who were sick, and we are never given the age of the daughter. With this in mind, I'd say the runt and the rest that can be found both here and in Zion Valley are what happens when someone younger gets sick and is reanimated by the spores. This is what I meant when I said that something, maybe something small, remains of them, as it looks like to me that these 3 stayed together all this time. Or, you know, Obsidian just wanted to use the environmental clues and the terminal entries to really drive home the horror of this illness. Going up the stairs at the back of this hall, we encounter our first spore plant. Now, this thing's clearly some type of Venus flytrap, and indeed, we do get this information later. We can see they're rooted to the ground, pun intended, and this makes sense. If they could walk around, Nintendo would sue for copyright infringement. They spit a type of liquid at you to damage you from afar, and try and sink their teeth into your arse up close. Now, given their size, they've clearly mutated or been cultivated in a way to increase their size. Given GN188 was affecting the crops, it stands to reason it may have made these plants a lot bigger. But this may only have happened after the vault fell, after years of exposure. What is clear is that they too seem to be infected by the spores, hence the name. This likely contributes to their increased aggression towards us, as ordinarily we'd be outside of what they'd usually go for, but we need to go deeper to get more information about them. Before we go down to the next level, we can find the only other remains we get in this vault, apart from the caves. We get them in the form of this skeleton, with the AER-14 prototype beside them. Now, this barricade was probably put up as the vault fell, to stop the Spore Carriers either going down or coming up, depending on who was located where, but this person probably came in after this. Otherwise, I'm not sure where the AER-14 came from. We get no mention of it in the vault, and it would be odd if an experimental weapon was just in this vault for some reason, but they seem to have died fighting the mantises. So, you know, not a very heroic end. Now we can head on down to Pest Control, the level of the vault that did research into how to deal with the various creatures that could harm the crops, and really the whole cause of this mess. When we go in, we can head up some stairs first to get to the locked door on this level that leads to the caves. Here we can see the roots and trees are still spreading upwards, possibly being the original source for them, as we find none in the caves later. There's one terminal here in the corner, and on it we get a lot of information on these creatures, and on the spores. It's a terminal with 3 entries. The first entry is BE908, the official designation of the Spore Plants, and they are indeed related to Venus flytrap. It states that they are a threat to creatures 5 times their size. Now, unless these were meant to deter bears and gorillas from damaging the crops, I think this is enough to conclude that they were much smaller at one point, again, meaning GN188 probably affected them, along with the spores. Now, apparently the secretion the researchers wanted volunteers to test is from them, and it lures in prey. Not a poison, but something that's appealing. We actually get it as a food additive later, suggesting that it is, in fact, delicious. However, they clearly have changed enough where now they have something they excrete that is harmful, as it's hardly nectar that's damaging us. The next entry is Mantis religiosa, and given they refer to it as the common mantis, I think that this is where the preying part of the name comes from. Apparently they didn't need to alter or change them at all, as they're naturally well-suited predators for what they need, hunting down all the prey that needs removing. Now they apparently cannibalize each other in a form of population control, preventing the numbers from ever getting too large. Now, obviously this is not the case anymore, as they have survived down here, somehow, for a long time without killing each other off, either because they started eating plants or some adaptation from the spores. On that topic, they were just ordinary mantises. They weren't giant before, so something caused them to change, and this all happened only shortly after the fallout, and the vault was sealed. Well, apart from the cave. So they couldn't have been mutated mantises that got in from the outside. Therefore, it makes more sense that they were the mantises already here, changed or altered by both the growth compound and the spores. At the very least, they were large enough that people could hear them in the vents, so whatever change happened to them, it was rapid. The final entry, that I'm definitely going to mispronounce, is the culprit of all of this. Bavaria morticana. a fungus that was only meant to affect insects. However, it wasn't naturally occurring, as they state it was developed to do this. This host of the fungus does die, but the fungal colony is able to pilot the corpse to infect others. How it actually moves the body, or identifies, or even knows what prey are, I don't know. But then again, cordyceps are real, and they manage it somehow. To the best of my recollection, Roanoke Gaming has several videos on fungal-like infections, so go check them out if you want to get more information. Now, the spraying of spores is likely how they eventually spread through the ventilation and into the rest of the vaults. Possibly, the mantises were infected, and from there, they got into the ventilation, and the spores began to spray into it. Maybe how it managed to get around the filters, now that I think about it. The time to cook, about 10 to 20 days, also explains how it moved among the population so much, allowing people to come in contact with so many. Although I wonder if this timeline wasn't vastly extended, in certain cases, for larger animals, given what we see later. I wonder if that last line about unsocial pests is a shot at the unsocial scientists and others of the vaults that managed to not get infected. What is clear is that it was never meant to spread to people, or at the least the vault scientists weren't aware that it could. We'll see later that there was the chance that somebody was. We find nothing about the lichen that is growing in the spore carriers. Due to this, I assume it's either something that developed in their bodies over time, or isn't actually lichen, but part of the spores. Given carriers and other places have it as well, that seems likely. So now to see the last parts of this vault, and determine what happened here, before we go looking to see what happened to the survivors. Because yeah, there were some. Down the hall past those stairs, we can see that some barricades were put up, likely by the panicking security and scientists. They may have been trapped down here, given people were turning upstairs. There are several penned areas full of plants, and it's here that they may have done their testing on the various specimens they had here. Although we don't know if there were more than these three. Probably for the best, the good old Qualtoth knows what would have happened if a corpse flower, or one of those supposed man-eater ones from South America got infected, and then juiced up with GN188. Going past the barricades, we can come to the last room that Keely set up some UV lamps in, but it's flooded with gas. This goes back to the modification she was referring to with respect to the air control system in her terminals. When we find her, she gives her reasoning for this, and honestly it's pretty sound. It goes back to the purest of reasoning: kill it with fire. Also in this level can be found the only piece of advanced equipment actually left working in the vault: the mainframe. It's here you can grab the research data, although whether you decide to deal with the NCR or the Brotherhood of Steel, that's up to you. Just past the room with the penned-in regions of vegetation, we can get our access to the major cave systems. Courtesy of a massive hole in the wall, I assume the mantises ripped, or the spore carriers, somehow. But before that, there's one last room with some mantises and a spore plant. I just thought it was funny, as the spore plant is where I'd assumed they'd be, in an enclosure where they were planted. Begs the question how the others got where they were, like the one in the living quarters, or the ones we find way later, in very separate locations. Keely also gives us some information that may answer this question, and it pretty much confirms a kind of cooperation, or symbiosis, between the creatures here. Heading into the cave system itself, it's a little odd. Unlike in the vault, there are no massive trees and roots here, which is surprising as I thought they would have kept growing down as well as up. Additionally, I thought this was the purpose of the cave. I mean, there's no reason that they needed a large space to cultivate the plants or mantises, as they were ordinary sized, as far as we know. The spores wouldn't have needed much space either. Yes, the fungi would generally thrive in a location like this, but there are plenty of artificial means to make it thrive as well. Therefore, I've always assumed the cave was meant to test the limits of their success with the crops. Could they both grow crops for food, and plants to create oxygen, that could then be pumped to the rest of the vault, in a cave? It makes sense to me, as there must have been some reason so many of the floors were set up with access to it. No other explanation immediately springs to mind. It's also here we can find Keely, and unfortunately for her, the creatures of the vault have decided to stop ignoring her. But we get a lot of incredibly interesting information off of her that kind of ties together the creatures here, and their relationships.
Took your sweet time. I suppose the NCR sent you? She's such a dear. Not like that pompous little pedant she works for. But that's neither here nor there. These plants have gotten completely out of control. I've got a plan to deal with them, but I'll need your help. Good. Meet me on the second level, and I'll explain what needs to be done. Hello. Good, you're here. Ready to begin? Time is of the essence, so I'll be brief. This place is filled with spores that are toxic to humans, and we need to get rid of them. I've pumped the vault full of a highly flammable gas that, once ignited, should destroy the vast majority of spores. There's one problem, though. The gas becomes semi-inert on exposure to oxygen, meaning the gas will have to be ignited close to where it's being introduced. I need you to find the vents where the gas is being pumped and ignite it. Oh, and survive the resulting blast. Good. Return to me when it's done. I suppose you have questions. Hurry up and ask them. A few things here and there, but a lot of the data has been corrupted, and all of the live samples have been contaminated by the spore plants. One interesting thing I found is that one of the chemicals secreted by the spore plant serves as a mild stimulant when ingested by humans. As far as I can tell, it has no side effects or addictive properties. Aside from the inherent psychological ones, of course. Now that I think of it, there was a Corporal Farber back in McCarran who'd probably be interested in it. There's a sample of it around here somewhere. Oh yes, I imagine there'll be quite an explosion when the gas gets set off. Fire will probably expand throughout the entire level in mere moments. That does pose a problem, doesn't it? If you could seal yourself inside a room before the explosion went off, you might be protected from the blast. Then again, the flames will probably blow into the rooms down there. Maybe if there were a room that was reinforced. Well, I'm sure you'll figure something out. From what I've been able to determine, the scientists here managed to breed them by combining traits from two distinct plant species. The resulting hybrid proved to be more adaptable than expected, however, and soon became a threat to humans. It's sad, really. All those wonderful minds undone by their own irresponsibility. That's a very good question. Actually, I didn't come up with it. The systems were already set to pump the gas when I first arrived here. I believe the scientists were in the process of attempting to ignite the gas just as we're about to do. And by we, I mean you, of course. Something prevented them from igniting the gas, obviously. I suppose it's possible that the gas triggered some kind of defensive reaction. Hordes of previously slumbering creatures may have awoken and entered a killing frenzy, ripping the hapless scientists into quivering, bloody chunks. You'll have to let me know when you get back from going downstairs. The mantises and spore plants virtually ignored me for most of the time I've been here. It was only once I began to investigate the 5th level that my presence began to agitate them. I guess I was a little too close to home for them. A few days ago, I was attacked by a large number of mantises and was knocked unconscious. When I woke up, I was in that cave. The mantises seemed to feed some of their prey to the plants. Fortunately for me, it appears the plants are disinclined to eat ghoul meat. Later. Ah, good. You survived. I was beginning to think you hadn't. You'll be pleased to know that the spores should no longer be a problem. Now all that's left is to ensure that none of this ever happens again. The research that led to these abominations must be erased. I've managed to create a connection to the Vault's backup system from here. I just have to remotely delete all the files, and we're done here. What's got you so flustered? You just about scared me to death shouting like that. Don't you realize what those files represent? If they get into the wrong hands, this could happen all over again. Only this time, the madness won't just be confined to a musty vault. Do you really want that on your conscience? I sure as hell don't. Oh, they did. I've taken extensive notes of all their successful experiments. Their research won't go to waste. As for the file erasure, it's done. We can rest easy. I've unlocked the door, so you're free to run along now. Although it pains me to say it, I wouldn't have made it out of here without your help. If you're heading back toward McCarran, tell Dr. Williams that she has my thanks as well.
So the first thing is why she was ignored. We know that the plants and the spore carriers are aggressive and attack to attempt to infect others with the spores. Now for the spore carriers, they're literally just bodies being piloted for this. For the mantises and spore plants, I don't think this is the case. They seem to still be alive and growing. Perhaps the reason why we still find spore carrier runts, as there's no more growth once the bodies are dead. But regardless, I do think the mantises are still infected to some degree, and this is why Keely was left alone by all of them. She's a ghoul. To the spores, her body might be inherently inhospitable, so she isn't seen as a carrier, and as a result is of no interest to the plants, insects, or the carriers. It was only after she ventured deep enough that they eventually considered her to be an intruder, or a threat, and attacked her. Even then, she wasn't turned. She also tells us the mantises apparently carry food to the spore plants. Now this suggests that there is some cooperation between them, but I don't think only the spores are responsible. I think the substance the plants secrete is also attracting the mantises, and by feeding the plants, they can get some themselves, but the plants in turn don't kill them. Now where the mantises are getting their food from, or whether the plants can still just grow normally, i.e. using light and soil nutrients, we don't know. The mantises could just be killing everyone who enters the vaults, but they seem to become carriers, so I don't think this is the case. We only find one skeleton down here, or part of one, at least, and I think that it might have belonged to Mathers. I say this as he seems to have been killed before people started reanimating, and the mantises may have been less inclined to leave the bodies intact back then, or it could be the other security guard that was left down here. This might also explain why we can find the spore plants in certain places. The mantises may have placed the seeds to increase the numbers of the plants that they can feed off of. It could also be the case that they were killing each other off as they were meant to, which kept the numbers somewhat low, but with other prey wandering into the vaults, and maybe the influence of the spores and the vegetation, they were still able to survive to a certain degree. She also gives us a lot of information about the spore plants. She confirms the secretion is indeed a psychotropic compound of some degree, and seems to have no harmful effects, apart from whatever it does psychologically. Another interesting point she raises is the spore plants were indeed crossed with, or altered by, some other plant. However, she doesn't seem to think the initial plant was created by the spores, as she says 2 plant species, not fungi. She states that after this happened, they became harder to control. Now whether this implies that the spore plants were actually what caused the attack the first time with the security officers in the cave, I'm not sure. No mention is made of the spore plants by the vault dwellers. They talk almost exclusively of the reanimating bodies. However, there are a large amount of spore plants in the cave, so perhaps they did indeed begin to grow aggressively, and were in fact the original source of all of this. She says they did contaminate a lot of samples, which could mean they are the primary means by which the out-of-control growth was occurring. Given they are also in Zion Valley, and in fact are slightly larger there, it could be the spores used the spore plants to spread out of control. They latched onto them, and used them as a point to produce more, and the secretion helped them lure in and infect the mantises. However, the idea that the scientists were responsible for this breed is actually disproven later. Weirdly, she doesn't actually really talk about the spore carriers at all, perhaps indicating that at no point did they actually get aggressive with her. She states that it was only the plants and the mantises. She does refer to them as slumbering creatures, and, as discussed, they are lying down when we encounter them, or at least they're meant to be. Some bug is preventing that, and they just crouch. So the spore carriers may in fact have been completely dormant until something viable like us came in. Additionally, I do think she means the plants when she says spore plants, not just a catch-all term for the spores. The last thing of interest from Keely is in regards to her comments expounding on her terminal entries she made about the ventilation being odd. She seems to think that the big brain countermeasure that all these researchers came up with was set the vault on fire using flammable gas in order to kill the spores in the air. Not exactly sure how they were planning to survive that though. But before they could set it off, some sort of defense response was triggered from the spores, and the carrier, mantises and plants attacked them and drove them out of the vault. Yeah, you heard me, they aren't dead. In fact, a pretty large amount of them made it out of the vault. Over 100, if a certain hard bastard is to be believed. This also explains how the plants got out of the vault. The idiots left the door open on the way out. Yes, the story of Vault 22 takes us all the way to 2 other DLC locations. Zion Valley first, and then finally Big MT. There's nothing else of interest in the vaults, besides deciding whether to burn all the spores with gas, or stealing all that research. Keely somewhat accurately points out that the spores could be a serious problem, as we're about to see, if they got out. Now why she doesn't just take the research on GN188, I'm not sure. Honestly, we don't really learn a lot about it, but it's reasonable to assume the changes to the spore plants, and to a certain degree the fungi, are probably related to it in some way. We do know it was used to change the behaviour of the crops, so it is a reasonable conclusion. However, the statement about it being a large risk seems unlikely. The vault's been open a long time now, and the spores haven't really spread. Additionally, while it does seem to infect people and insects, we don't see any other animals being controlled by it. So while the spores being directly integrated into the crops the NCR use could be a clear threat, I don't think on their own they're of much risk, especially as we'll soon see the limited degree to which they spread once out of the vault. Now if there are other effects of the plants and GN188, then her fears are reasonable, but from what we saw, the situation in the vault was either a perfect storm of things going wrong, or actually engineered to go wrong. Now we need to head to Zion Valley, but before we get into that story, I want to preface something. This is going to involve Randall Clark. I'd actually forgot about that until I went to get all my footage. We don't have time to cover his whole story in this video, so this is only going to cover his story in direct relation to the goings-on of the Vault 22 dwellers, at least in relation to the spores. After that, we're heading to Big MT. If you want me to cover him again, I'll gladly do so let me know in the comments. Our first port of call is in the Stone Bones Cave. Here, as we walk in, we find the poor bastards that tried to cross the man after he'd set out on a mission of righteous retribution on these former vault dwellers. Now there's 4 bodies here. Remember that number, as it does not match up with what we're going to read later on. Heading deeper into the cave and passing all the traps that nobody in centuries somehow managed to set off, we come to the camp he was in when he started his campaign. Here we get a terminal that tells us all about the arrival of the Vault 22 dwellers in the canyon. The first entry is dated 2096, Part 1. It talks about a group that he's been following that came all the way from Central America, and that they've been attacked by more than 100 survivors from the vaults. It could just be people who found the suits, but we'll see later on, this is definitely them. They've taken a group of the survivors hostage, and Randall then begins scoping out their camp, probing for weaknesses, and coming up with a rescue plan. But it was too late. The Vault 22 dwellers have apparently turned to cannibalism to survive, and ate the survivors they kept. Now he does comment on them coughing a lot, and this fits with the symptoms we've seen so far. The problem is that it's been 19 years since the fallout, but we have no idea how long it's been since the vault was infected. I think it's safe to assume it's been longer than 20 days. This is why I said it could take longer for larger animals. Or it could be that, once they got out, the concentration of the spores was low enough that the spread of the infection was much slower. But all that aside, they did turn to cannibalism. And because of that decision, Randall Clark makes them bleed. It's also not lost on me the irony of a group of survivors from a vault that was trying to perfect crops turning to cannibalism. The next few pages, and indeed the next entry, tell the glorious saga of him ambushing and systematically killing 24 members of the Vault 22 dwellers. On his own, in under 2 weeks. Jesus Christ. He also makes a few other comments regarding their health, and it's clear they're infected. Now, since it's been 19 years since the fallout, on the extreme end, they've either been sick a very long time, or they're not sick anymore but the spores did permanent damage. As in, even after the spread had stopped, and indeed may be gone altogether, the respiratory systems never recovered, but we will get some information soon showing it never really went away. The Part 2 entry is about him taking what seemed to be only a single wound after killing this many people, and then managed to get back to his cave to set traps. They found him 2 days later, and only one of the morons dying under some rocks, or at least I think that's what it was, alerted him. He killed them all and left the cave. Now the weird thing is that he says it was a patrol of 3, but there's 4 bodies, and he definitely states that people will be looking for the 3 of them, so I don't know where the last one came from. But yeah, a lot of people made it out of Vault 22. Now given there wasn't hundreds of Spore Carriers in the vault, this kind of makes sense. Although where all these people lived, given it was a small vault, I don't know. But they managed to make it out, likely when setting everything on fire didn't work out, and the Spore Carriers drove them out. It's also clear that some, or all of them, are infected, or at least dealing with the aftermath of it. Additionally, given the runts we find later, unless others in the canyon have been infected over time, not all of them were adults. But it has been a lot of time, so others could have been infected. Now, on to the next cave. This cave's the last one we shall look at. I'm only be taking a look at the first entry, as it gives us the last information we need with regards to the survivors from Vault 22. We can head to the back of the cave, and get to another one of Randall Clark's hideaways. Now we pass a large amount of Spore Carriers and Spore Plants in the way, and we're going to talk about that. But first, the entry. The year is now 2097, and the date is January 13th. It's been 10 months of combat, and he won. He managed to whittle their numbers down to 34 from over 100. He's still calling them coffers, so some of them must still have issues from the spores, even after all this time. They seem to have been collecting their dead, or at least some of them, and ate what was left before leaving the valley entirely. A woman called Sylvie from the group has gotten caught in one of his traps after having left the group due to their treatment of women. It would seem that cannibalism may not have been all they resorted to. She confirms that it is the spores, though she's apparently not infected, or at least shows no symptoms. She says she'd like to learn from him, as apparently she never got the hang of, or got the opportunity to learn about, surviving outside the vault. And that's all you get. If you want more of his story, well, you'll just have to let me know in the comments. But this is where the story of Vault 22 ends. Only 34 of them were left, and they seem to have fled the valley for parts unknown. He makes no mention of them dropping or dying in large numbers, or of the Spore Carriers, so I think they were never infected to such a degree that the infection could progress to that stage. This means that it was the continued exposure in the vaults that actually resulted in people dying and their corpses reanimating in the time they did, as opposed to a certainty once you're infected. The only effect it seems to have had in the dwellers is breathing problems, though some, like Sylvie, may have been immune, or asymptomatic. Now what is strange is there are a lot of Spore Carriers and plants in this last cave. Yet I find it unlikely he would have left that out of his entries if it had happened. Honestly, I'm not sure about this one. The terminal entries here go on for 4 more years, so I don't understand how he wouldn't have noticed. I have 3 guesses. The first is this was either the remnants that returned to the valley after he was gone, and the slow progression of the spore infection finally caught up with them. They took shelter in the caves, and then they succumbed. Perhaps they brought some of the spore plant seeds with them due to the secretion, and wanting more of it, like the mantises may have. The only other way I can think for the spore plants being present in the valley is either they brought some of GN188 with them and exposed more plants, or somehow the seeds stayed in their persons until now. I also think it's pretty unlikely that they came back, as he lived for quite a while after this, so you'd think there'd be more of them, or if they were going to turn, it should have already happened. This one, as a result, is pretty unlikely. Option 2, this was a completely different group that was infected. Some of the spores infected others in the valley, which there were, and over time spread to a large enough degree to kill them and turn them. This also seems unlikely, as if those exposed to such a large concentration in the vault didn't turn, it's strange the people exposed from secondary contact with those infected, but not to the level of spore carriers, would have. The strongest bit of evidence I have for this is the runts. I find it very hard to believe that Randall Clark would have hunted and killed younglings, given both his past and what he does later. Therefore, the idea the runts are the reanimated remains of the ones he killed from the original Vault-22 group wouldn't make sense, meaning they need to be others that were infected and either died later, or succumbed after taking up residence in the cave. They could have been from Vault-22 and either already infected, or, if indeed enough time had passed, were born outside of the vault. Then they could have succumbed to the infection over time, or were infected by their parents and were not as successful at fighting it off. Option 3 is the bodies were left here, as in Randall had collected them, possibly to deprive the Vault-22 dwellers of a source of food as they eat their dead. He killed them but left the bodies, and over time the spores grew, until they were enough that they could take over the bodies. Given the less ideal conditions of here compared to the vault, and the lack of GN188, this could explain the dramatically increased timeline. One problem with this theory is the Vault-22 guard camp in Zion Valley. Here we find the remains of a group he wiped out, but these bodies, like the ones in the first cave, stay dead. Now he may have burned the bodies given the state of the camp, which could have killed the spore. It could also be the wide open space wasn't ideal enough for the spores to thrive, so it may not be too strange. But if these factors weren't contributing to them not coming back, it is strange they didn't reanimate, if that is where the other spore carriers came from. Also, why did the ones in the first cave not come back then? It's unlikely that none of them were infected, and he got out of there quick, which means burning the bodies doesn't seem likely. He also wouldn't have had much of a reason to. The cave should have made a great environment. An alternative is that some of the bodies did indeed come back, and the cave they ended up in was just a natural habitat for them. I also want to take a minute to talk about the timeline here, without going into the details of the later parts of the story. At this point, he's about 43. Sylvie's younger than he is, a good deal from some of his comments, probably late 20s, early 30s. But if she was from the vaults, which seems to be the case, as she says she was never infected by what the others were infected by, then she must have been quite young while she was there. But the impression I get from her comments is that it was something that happened a long time ago. Really, it's quite hard to say. How she wouldn't know about surviving properly after decades outside the vault, I don't know. The way they were treated might have something to do with it. But if it was because she hadn't been outside the vault long, then that means that the fall took a lot longer than we thought. Although why it would take that long, given all we know, is confusing in of itself. One argument for why it may not have been that long since they left the vault is how so many of them have survived in such a large group for 19 years. Without a stable food source, it feels like a lot more of them should have died after so long outside the vault. Unfortunately, we just don't have enough information, and we'll likely never know, for sure. But there is one thing we haven't talked about. Where did all this come from? Was someone beyond Vault-Tec to blame for all this? Well, shockingly, yes. In a surprise twist, we can in fact not blame Vault-Tec entirely for this mess. We can blame Big MT for some of it. Within the dumpster fire of mental research facilities that are housed in Big MT, we get one that, even with a name, just screams it was involved. The X22 Botanical Gardens. I mean, even the numbering's the same. When we arrive, the first thing to note is that, like the vault, it has a huge network of roots and trees woven throughout it. Unlike the vault, they are much larger here. This tracks, given it's not as far underground, and this was the source of the miracle fertilizer. So the limiting factors that, even in the vault, didn't really stop them, are even less here. The building itself is destroyed, but we can see that its research, like with the vault, did still cause some growth of crops here, as this place served as someone's camp for a time. Whether the large root system that was spreading out is part of the reason the building's destroyed, or perhaps another factor, I don't know. Dotted around the building, we can also find some fertilizer. Fertilizer that I'm assuming is GN188, or related to it. which explains why, even here, things still grew. What it doesn't explain is why the Spore Carriers and the Spore Plants are also here. In fact, what is even more interesting is we find a Spore Carrier here, called Patient Zero. Now the name itself is very provocative, Patient Zero. I mean, it's pretty clear this is the first Spore Carrier, right? The lab is called X22, there's similar growth everywhere. It looks very much like the Vault-22 situation, but this is far away from both the Vault and Zion Valley, so it makes someone coming in from the outside fairly unlikely. Additionally, you can get an ending for Old World Blues, where the Garden AI makes a comment regarding having infected a vault a long time ago. Now given there's no way they should have data on the vault, unless of course they'd hacked and accessed Vault-Tec's network, then they must have known what was happening. This seems to imply that Vault-Tec got GN188 and the spores from Big MT, but Big MT seems to have used Vault-Tec for their own experiment. They knew the spores would have a bad effect on humans, and they gave it to them anyway, or they had their suspicions, but wanted to see if someone else could work out the kinks. Which, I mean, Vault-Tec, what were they thinking? Another possibility is they just wanted to see Vault-Tec fail. They didn't know exactly when the world was going to end, even if they were preparing, so perhaps they hoped the vault would be destroyed, and publicly embarrass Vault-Tec before the world burned down. Another reason I think they knew is they seemed to have provided Vault-Tec with another specimen that would react badly with the spores and GN188, the Spore Plants. Or more specifically, what the Spore Plants were before they reacted with the spores and GN188. This seems to track with what Keely talked about, as they reacted to the cultivar and the spores in pretty much the exact same way in Vault-22 as they did in Big MT. There's also no way they got all the way here from the valley or the vault. Additionally, the chances of them also just happening to be experimental subjects of both X22 and Vault-22 is pretty remote, in my opinion. Keely, as mentioned before, does state that the Spore Plant was developed in the vault, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Either that, or she didn't realize the cultivar was what altered the Spore Plants, not the scientists. So let's lay it all out. X22 was being used to develop a compound who either accelerate plant growth, or allow its alteration. Overall, they seem to have succeeded. It's doing its job. But they, like Vault-22, experimented with some sort of pest control, using both GN188 and the spores. This resulted in some sort of altered or mutated form of the spore that can infect both vegetation and mammals, as well as insects. At some point, the lab was destroyed, but before this, the accelerated growth began to occur, hence the vast root network. All of this could also have been separate from the crop growth research, and they were actually trying to weaponize the vegetation, in which case, good job, it worked too well. The Spore Carriers, due to the isolated nature of Big MT, have been left undisturbed all this time. They don't seem to have spread as effectively, possibly due to the non-cave-like structure they find themselves in, and the lack of viable hosts. Big MT was aware of this effect to some extent before the fallout, and gave the plants, spores and GN188 to Vault-Tec. They may have even suggested a pest control program. Now we can't be sure when this happened exactly, but given the large amount of Spore Carriers and Patient Zero, along with the plants, I think it's likely this was pre-war. Lending more credibility, they lent the technology to Vault-Tec knowing what it could do. Now there is the possibility that the effects of the spores only became clear after the fallout, but at that time, it was too late. Then the Garden Intelligence realized what was likely going to happen, which is why they say they infected a vault. But I prefer the idea of someone giving Vault-Tec a taste of their own medicine. But this is when it all started to go wrong for Vault-22. An unknown period of time before 2096, the vault fell, though given Sylvie knows they were all infected, unless she was born outside the vault, which could explain why she isn't, then it was probably only a few years. This makes the most sense, as a group of over 100 people surviving for over a decade, just after the world had ended, is pretty unlikely. Yes, we've seen a few examples of this over the years, but not really with as many people or with the same circumstances. It seems to have started with GN188 being applied to the spores in the caves, which either acted as a catalyst for its changes, or just accelerated the growth, and like discussed, they were already engineered to infect people. The experimentation with vegetation was already well underway in the vault at this point, so it appears to have been somewhat of a slow burn. The start seems to have been the killing of a security guard by the mantises, or it could have been that Mathers was killed, and then their body was used to create the first Spore Carrier in the vault. Either way, Dr. Peters, who went into the cave, was the first infected that was taken back into the vault. Around this time, the spores started to spread, as did the mantises, also infected with the spores. This seems to have contributed to the spreading of the spores around the filters, with the mantises acting as hosts capable of circumventing them. Now it's also possible that noise could have been Spore Carriers in the vents, but the chittering was identified by Keely as the mantises. Additionally, it seems pretty unlikely people would have gotten sick, died, and then reanimated and hid in the ventilation system, and nobody noticed. While Dr. Peters was dying, others were already becoming infected, and when he turned, the physician at the time seems to realize what was going to happen. Some sort of resistance by security was mounted, and a plan to flood the vault with flammable gas to eradicate the spores was attempted, although it ultimately failed, or was never carried out successfully. The response by the Spore Carriers and mantises, as speculated by Keely, forced the dwellers to flee the vault. Given the amount that is present in the air, along with the time of exposure, a large amount of vault dwellers seem to have been affected by the spores. The spore plants also seem to have taken a ride on their clothing in seed form, unless they brought them on purpose, and it wasn't until later they developed into what they are now. The mantises in the vault certainly seem to have been infected by the spores, contributing to the spread, but just how dangerous they are, and what size they were at when the vault fell, we can only speculate. Given what seems to have happened to Mathers and the first security guard, I'm of the opinion they could kill even back then, either due to their numbers, or they'd already grown at this point. Now whether this was due to radiation somehow getting into the vaults, or GN-188 affecting them in a secondary manner after the plants, we don't know, but they are larger and they're more aggressive, so I think some change is reasonable. The symbiosis they form with the spore plants could have also have been under the influence of the spores, but as discussed, I don't think it was the sole contributing factor. The spore plants could have also played a larger role in the attacks and ultimate fall of the vault, but given their stationary nature and the lack of information on their capabilities at the time of the fall, we can't be sure. As for the cultivar itself, we learn precious little, beyond that it does in fact allow the behaviour of crops to be altered, so to some degree, the experiment was a success. We don't know how long they wandered after leaving the vault, or how many died in the way, but eventually they came to Zion Valley. Given Randall's entries, this was about 19 years after the world ended, so they could have actually been wandering for a long time, depending on when the vault fell. At this point, however, they had already fallen far, resorting to cannibalism and mistreatment of people in their camp. They seemed to have been infected as well, being dubbed coughers by Randall, this persistent cough being an early symptom of the infection. I think that, without constant exposure or higher concentration, the fungus isn't able to spread as effectively. Either that, or they were no longer infected, but the damage to their lungs had been done. I think the former is more likely, as there are quite a few spore carriers in Zion Valley, suggesting they were still infected. But once dead, the fungus could actually spread properly. Additionally, it may be the case the bodies in the cave Randall was using all became spore carriers, suggesting that simply dying wasn't enough. They needed conditions like a lack of light and a cooler area to properly thrive. Again, limiting the threat these spores could actually pose if left unchecked, if they, say, actually managed to get out of the vaults, which, I mean, they did. This tracks, as the Vault 22 dwellers travelled quite a distance to get to Zion Valley, yet we've seen no evidence of a massive infestation of the spores anywhere else. One more thing I'll mention in passing is that Fallout 2 did have spore plants. I bring this up because it also relates to what Keely was saying with regards to them spreading. But besides the name, we can't be sure they're related as we don't really get enough information about them. Additionally, given the amount of time that has passed, if that's all they've managed to spread to, then once again, the threat is actually fairly limited. All in all, this vault actually seems to have had the potential for some good, or at the very least was probably in the category of vaults that acted somewhat as a control, as opposed to inflicting an experiment on people. The research here could have benefited other vaults, and indeed possibly the pre-war world, given the global food shortages. It definitely would have helped in the wasteland humanity now finds itself in, giving ways to grow crops either in isolated areas away from predators, radiation and storms, or in arid environments like the Mojave itself. Now, how much control they would have had over GN-188 is unknown, as besides being used to alter the crops and accelerate the growth, or alter them to facilitate unrestricted growth, we get next to no information about it, beyond the fertilizer we find. We also can't be sure if it ultimately caused the mutation of the spores, turning them into what they are now, or if it even had an effect at all. As in, the spores were always designed for this, and GN-188 causing it to go wrong was just a cover Big MT cooked up. I'm of the opinion that Big MT knew what the spores could do, and gave them to Vault-Tec with the intention to cause harm, and the expectation that it would go wrong. Perhaps they saw the isolated, secure vault as a better test environment for the spores, as opposed to risking them getting out into the world. But get out they did, although their overall threat, in the end, was limited. What is sad is they still affected and changed most of those who escaped the vault. I'm not talking about the damage to the respiratory system, or them turning into spore carriers later. I'm talking about them becoming monsters anyway, killing and eating people, not too dissimilar to those they left behind in the vaults. Except they had an excuse. The survivors really didn't. At least not one acceptable to one of the hardest lads who ever roamed the waste. And for many of them, what the spores didn't finish, he did.